Well, my first question really has to go to the author of the book. Leonardo, why did you write the book?
For a number of reasons. One is that, as far as I'm concerned, there is a lack of evangelical writings dealing with post-Vatican II Catholicism. There is much talking about ecumenical relationships, changes going on in Rome, and a number of enthusiasts about the present Pope, but a lack of theological discernment and historical awareness of the Roman Catholic Church as a whole and the Papacy in particular. So, being a pastor in Rome and a theologian working in Rome, I think that one of my responsibilities, not only for my own local ministry, but for the more general service that we are all called to perform for the Church, was and is to at least provide resources that would help, hopefully, the Church to engage the Roman Catholic Church in a evangelical way and hopefully in an informative and constructive way.
Can I put a question maybe to the rest of the guests across the panel? How many, Jacob, maybe I could start with you, how many doctrines do divide Roman Catholicism from Protestantism? Are we talking about a fairly small scale, slight divergence on a few things, or are we talking about a more wholesale difference of faith?
I think the answer to that question probably falls into two camps. The first one is, I would suggest there are a small number of doctrines, but they are significant doctrines, such as the issue of authority, even the papacy and where it fits in the overall picture. So there are a number of key doctrines that I would suggest relatively few perhaps that make a big difference, but they are significant in and of themselves. The reason I say I think it fits into two categories, though, is I think that is particularly the issue if you're dealing, as it were, theologically church on church. I think if you're dealing with modern Catholics who are not particularly devout, and in a place like Ireland, that's the vast majority, you may have a much different perspective on that. There may be other issues that has to be considered at that point.
In which case, would anyone else like to pick up on that and answer the same sort of question?
Michael, I think it depends on how you count. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I have a list I give out in my systematic theology class of 13 doctrines, but I don't have to enumerate them. I'd agree with what Jacob says. The issue of authority is of massive importance. If I have two religious systems and one says everything I believe must be demonstrated from the Bible, and the other says everything I believe is demonstrated from the Bible plus the teaching of the Pope and the bishops, well, that difference alone can bring in hundreds of differences because it's a different source of authority. And then if you have a different basis of justification, which is the heart of our gospel, that means that people who differ on the doctrine of justification may not be teaching at all the true gospel. If you don't have true authority in a true gospel, how many doctrines do you need to enumerate before there are substantial differences?
Could I ask you to unpack that one? Because in some senses that's a controversial statement, that we have a real and substantial difference on justification. And I say it's slightly controversial given that the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church have said they've made a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. But you're saying when that joint declaration didn't actually amount to a real agreement on the doctrine of justification? I'm trying to set that up.
No, because it used slippery and vague language. Catechism of the Catholic Church section 1129, the Church affirms that for believers, the sacraments of the new covenant are necessary for salvation. And 1989, justification is not only the remission of sins, but also the sanctification and renewal of the inner man. So justification comes about only by inward change within us, which is not completed in this life, is only completed when we've spent some time in purgatory and we're perfectly purified. Well, that's a massive difference. And justification not by trusting in Christ alone, but by trusting in Christ and then getting repeated infusions of grace through the sacraments. My goodness. That's the cause of the Reformation. That's the root of the Reformation.
I think my own experience in my own journey with God, as well as what I continue to experience today in Ireland, is that the most significant difference in that issue is that we as evangelicals talk about being saved through Christ. I think the Catholic Church talks, and the general experience is that you are saved through the church. My sense was if I was okay with the church, I was okay with God.
Yeah.
And realized that that is indeed not true. So the issue of justification is, yeah, without question, a significant issue that is important.
Please, Leonardo.
Going back to the basic differences, I would maybe controversially argue that the basic difference lies not only on single issues, on single doctrines like the doctrine of authority, of ecclesiology, of the doctrine of salvation, but we are talking about different theological frameworks, different theological DNAs, which have considerable overlapping, considerable similarities, and yet substantial differences. And these differences relate to the whole of the system, not so much only relate to specific, they show up in specific issues in more significant degrees and in more apparent ways, but if you are careful, and I think that our forefathers, the reformers, and were able to spot that the difference, of course, emerged more evidently in the areas of soteriology and ecclesiology, but were actually emerging from a different theological DNA.
Could I ask you to unpack that? Because you say it's a controversial statement. I'm not sure it's a statement that we very naturally grasp either, because it's commonly said that Roman Catholics and Protestants, we have agreement on the doctrine of God and the person of Christ. That together we believe in the triune God. Together we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God who became flesh for us. We have that agreement. Where we differ is on, for example, the nature of justification, the nature of the church. But you're saying it's not quite so simple as that.
Yes, you're right. I think we have a formal agreement, and to some extent that formal agreement also carries content. But if you have a significant divergence and even difference in, say, Mariology lies at the heart of the Catholic vision and impinges upon the view of Christ, the doctrine of Christ, because it supplements it with another sub-mediator. And it impinges upon the doctrine of the Trinity, because basically Mary does the work of the Spirit, what is the Bible portrays as the work of the Spirit. And so my question is, are we talking about the same Trinity? Or, yes, of course, we do, to a certain extent. We use the same language. And then I think there's a further issue, that is, we can use, and we use the same language. We use the same vocabulary. Grace, faith, gospel, mission, even Trinity, Son, Father, and Holy Spirit. But I think there is homework to do in order to assess and to go deeper than simply repeating that using the same phonetic words means using the same theological and biblically grounded words. I would argue that our problem lies deeper than just authority and ecclesiology, but goes into the very heart of our respective theological constructions.
So, Henrik, picking that up, particularly with your experience of living in a country that's got a large Catholic population, do you see that Catholics and Protestants seem to use the same words, such as grace and tradition and church, but actually mean different things by them, so that a Catholic and a Protestant, for example, could say, yes, we believe in salvation by grace, but actually they're saying quite different things by those same words?
Well, I feel very strange here up front, being surrounded by such huge authorities in the field of theology. I'm a simple engineer with a passion for evangelism, and my main point is to see people finding Jesus and being saved by grace. And what we see, that the average man in the street in Poland, and I think in most countries of the world, cannot care less about the doctrine, about the teaching. It's more like a peasant religion with all its negative forms that is being somehow attributed to their brains. And the real division is not so much between Catholics and Protestants, but it's between people who care and who don't care, who are serious about God, who are really trying to be His followers, and those who are rejecting Him totally. So our experience is that Catholic Church is extremely varied. And what I really like in the book that we have been studying, I bought it on Kindle, so if you noticed one sale on Kindle, it was me. I really like it, the idea of allowing two different or various different doctrines and dogmas being one next to the other, even when they contradict. And that's okay. And I really found it as a key word for my understanding on the book when you described Vatican I with the whole concept of Pope never making any problems. It means whatever was said in the past was always good. So now, new movements, Catholics who really try to live close to the Scripture, are also included. It's all pretty inclusive. And so they believe what they believe. And here in Wisła, we had some events, some major events, evangelistic events, gathering tens of thousands of people, where a dear friend of mine, a Catholic priest, from the stage would tell people, if you believe you are saved because you have been baptized, that's the biggest mistake of your lifetime. If you don't come to Jesus, if you don't want to give your life to Him, that's it, you know. So many, many different people interpret, and to answer in those many words your question, I think yes, it's not only Catholics and Protestants that we think differently, but the average Protestant has not a clue about theology, and he cannot care less. And my first impression after reading an excellent book of our friend was that it would be very good if he would also write another book on the fall of Protestantism. Why there are so many problems if we believe our doctrine is so wonderful. So there is somewhere a problem here with our human interpretation of Word of God, who is absolutely given by God. Nobody would ever challenge authority of the Scripture. And we really want close to it and just follow as well as we only can with the tremendous help of some great books we can have access to, but try to discover the real meaning of the Scripture, because it's when we say that Catholics are interpreting it, you know, word and tradition and the teaching of the bishops, that's exactly what is being said there. We have our own culture that puts colors, and part of the culture is a tradition in our Protestant circles. You know.
Thank you. I'd love to come back to some of that, but Jacob, first of all,
just one comment. I would agree fully that with Leonardo that sometimes we use the same language, same words, and they don't quite mean the same things, because language is a living thing and it's slippery. But I think the opposite is also true. I find sometimes in speaking to people of faith, I'm looking for certain evangelical words from them. And if I'm not getting them, I'm writing them off. But if I listen longer and talk longer to them, I actually begin to realize here is someone who has true faith. They don't use my words, but I have to listen. So it works on both sides of the equation, I think.
I think the very helpful perspective that I got from Leonardo's seminar 2 days ago was something he alluded to in his first comment, that it isn't just individual doctrines that we differ on. There's an entire system. And the system includes the church as the ongoing incarnation of Christ. So if the church is Christ present in the world today, it is so easy to understand how Catholics think of the church as having Christ's authority in what it teaches. And the necessity of coming into the church, the Roman Catholic Church, to receive a full measure of grace. Because if the church is the presence of Christ in the world and it's just that organization, then of course there will be a desire to absorb everyone else into it. My wife Margaret and I, Margaret is here, we have good friends in Arizona who are Roman Catholics, and they're genuinely born-again believers. And I think before I heard Leonardo, I was thinking, well, how wonderful we have so much in common. But they bring with them an entire worldview about the church being the incarnation of Christ, and this harder to explain, but nature-grace continuum, where in the created order in all human beings, there's some measure of saving grace, and they need to come into the center of the church to get more of it. It doesn't have a sufficient view of the radical break because of sin between us and the Creator. So these are big issues, more than my list of 13 items. They're whole worldview, whole system issues. And Leonardo was so helpful in clarifying that.
I'm wondering if it would be possible, Leonardo, to pick up Henrik's challenge, where he's saying he'd like you to write a new book on the fall of Protestantism. I wonder if I could just ask you maybe to unpack for us. So, have Roman Catholic beliefs crept into Protestant circles? Are we seeing Protestants being subconsciously Roman Catholic in some of their theology and therefore unable to tell that they're different?
Well, that's a big question. And I think that this is possible, and I think that is happening. And it speaks about our evangelical lack of appreciation of our doctrinal identity. So much of the evangelical identity has been defined out of spiritual practices, low-key doctrinal depth, and a few basic markers, minimal common denominator. And less so in terms of providing a full biblical scope that would account for the whole of the scriptures and the whole of the Christian life. And so the problem is that in this evangelical vacuum, the Catholic substance, no longer the controversial, antagonistic, post-Tridentine, Vatican I type of Catholicism, but these kind, gentle, persuasive, diffusing type of Catholicism that emerged out of Vatican II is gradually filling the gaps and filling the vacuum that we have left in our own. I'm talking about in general terms, of course. And our own fragmentation has allowed the central structures of the church to become very popular, even in evangelical circles. When the Pope speaks, many people say, oh, at least there is one who speaks on behalf of us. And that speaks about our own lack of ability of creating, structures that could perform that service for the church. There are other practices. There are people who are nowadays fascinated with Jesuit spiritualities, pilgrimages, spiritual practices that belong to other traditions than the Roman Catholic, than the evangelical one. And so the less we care for our evangelical theological identity, the more dangers we run into to absorb all kinds of issues. And Roman Catholicism has a full cart of options we can buy into if we don't have our own biblically defined identity.
One question I'd like us to address is the future of how Protestants and Roman Catholics relate. And we're in a situation in the 21st century where the church is increasingly globalized, where different continents are able to talk to each other more easily. And one of the things that strikes me as I look at the worldwide scene is it seems to me, for example, as I look at America, that the fact that America has never had its own Reformation in its own history may actually tell, and I'd love to ask our American on this, that it seems to me that for Europeans, so myself as an Englishman, my countrymen have been burned for their faith. And there's something in the national conscience, and you have this very strongly in Ireland as well. There's something in the national conscience that remembers Protestant Catholic differences, sometimes in a very unhealthy, combative way. But you don't have that so much in America. And what I'm wondering is, with globalization, might that then affect Protestant Catholic relations? Is it the case, Wayne, that in America you're more likely to have books saying the Reformation is over because there hasn't been that own Reformation experience in American history?
I hadn't thought of that, Michael, but it's certainly possible. We don't have a national memory of people being burned at the stake for becoming Protestants. And you have the cross in the street, in Broad Street in Oxford, which is a perpetual memory. I think there are other factors in the United States as well, which rightly bring evangelicals and Catholics closer together. We are united on support for laws restricting abortion and euthanasia, for instance. When Margaret and I had children in secular high school in the United States, their close friends were often Roman Catholics because they had the same moral standards with which they were raised. And the non-believers or the liberal Protestant families had very few moral standards. And political advocacy, the 4 conservative justices on our Supreme Court now are all 4 Roman Catholic. And Protestants are so thankful that they're there because they're ruling according to the text of the Constitution. So politically and socially and morally, we see natural alliances. But Leonardo is warning us, there's a whole worldview and a whole system that comes with this. And the goal, his last chapter, that they may be one, the goal of Roman Catholics is full and visible unity. It's to absorb whatever they can of evangelicals into the Roman Catholic fold. And so out of a couple conversations, Leonardo's mention of before the Reformation, there was the monastic movement, which was threatening the unity of the Roman Catholic Church. And the response of the church was to absorb the monastic movement into the church. And then more recently in the 20th century, we've had the charismatic movement, and Catholics absorbed the charismatic movement into the Catholic Church. And we had the Alpha Course coming out of Holy Trinity Brompton in London, and the Catholics have absorbed the Alpha Course. And well, we like this too, come join us. But the goal is to bring everyone into visible unity with the one true church.
That's helpful to talk about the co-belligerence that Protestants and Catholics are having on ethical issues while being very wise to the theological differences.
And I'm for the co-belligerence, and I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. We're going to have to pause there. Now's our chance for you to, I hope you've got a card near you. If you haven't, I'm sure a volunteer can bring you one. Now's a chance to be able to scribble down your questions for our panel. If you've got things you'd like to ask that we haven't managed to get round to yet, we'll have a few minutes to do this, and then we'll put your questions to the panel. I think I'd probably like to open it up to everyone, but I'd like to start with Henrik. And it's to do with this. Practically speaking, is it right to have unity with the Catholic Church? For example, Alpha courses, local church fellowship, where do you draw the line?
Whoa. We are involved in a big way in the internet evangelism. And as in Poland we have 95% Roman Catholics, if somebody don't like it, he should emigrate. And it's reality. And very soon we discover that there is a major interest among, quote mark, evangelical Catholics in seeing a revival among their people. And in a scale situation, it's an obvious choice to look for cooperation. And in our theology, I know this would be against everything what our dear brothers are experts on. We have our whole theology put into two words, and this is Jesus only. And so, again, everybody would interpret this in his own way, I'm sure. That's a typical example of a cliche kind of a statement. But for us, we have discovered a lot of people among Catholic leadership, including some priests, who are absolutely rejecting Catholic teaching on Mary, on you know, all the crazy theological theses. They are simply not believing in it, and surprise, surprise, they are told it's okay. In the inclusiveness of the Catholicism, they give people a freedom to pick up, as you have written in your book, what you really like and make it your own thing. So there is hardly any, you know, one-line teaching. Of course there is one, and this is the Pope's teaching. So when Ratzinger was writing his book, his thesis on, you know, salvation by grace, all Protestants were just absolutely thrilled and happy. Then the next one was on Mary, now Francis with the prayer to Mary. Protestants were keeping quiet, you know, because it didn't work for them. So I would say the major problem is more on the side of Protestants than on the Catholics, because they of course work rationally. Yes, they want to reach everybody into one flock, but what is our reaction to it? And you know, that's the problem. We are the problem more than they. Because liberalism, of course, has killed the edge of evangelical teaching. You know, when I have a friend in the States, a young man, he wanted to find a girl in the evangelical Bible Belt living internet matching portal. And he asked one question: after which date will you go with me to bed? And he had 60 responses, and there was not a one girl who said, I will never do it before marriage. You know, I am Lutheran, and the Swedish Archbishop is a lesbian woman. My son is now in Salzburg, and there is a little Lutheran church there, and there is a couple, pastoral couple, two gays. What is the message we are giving to the people? So then people look into Pope, who would say, well, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. And even more, lots of those no religious people would look into Islam and ISIS, and they will find there the direction to expand.
Henrik, that puts us on to another question. I don't want to come away from that question because I think I'd like others to contribute.
Well, I would
Wayne,
love to hear Leonardo give
Absolutely.
some counsel on what to do about unity.
Yeah. Can I throw this one question in to just sort of broaden it out so we can keep asking that question on ecumenical relations? But on Henrik's point there, someone had also asked, isn't Protestantism in danger of becoming irrelevant or absorbed by Catholicism? Don't we need another Reformation? You're talking about the problem of liberalism in Protestantism. Don't we need more unity, more ethical concerns, and so on? So essentially, I'd love to ask that question about Catholic-Protestant relations, but if it does impinge on the need for a new Reformation within Protestant circles, feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, I think that the whole Vatican II program and vision was to provide a more Catholic church than a Roman church, more universal church, so shifting the emphasis or the balance between the Roman element that was very prevalent at Vatican I, papal infallibility, at the expense of the Catholic element, reversing the emphasis to being a very Catholic, universal, global, inclusive, welcoming, and less Roman. Not to the point of excluding the Roman element, otherwise it would have been just another version of another liberal church, but renegotiating the balance. And so the Vatican II basically made provision for the next century Catholic Church to have different wings, different orientations within it. The evangelical one, the more traditional one, the Marian one, the political one, the traditional one, the cultural one, all navigating around, circulating around the same center. Now, this is the question we want to ask. Is this the kind of unity that we want to go for? In the sense, is this the picture of Christian unity that we derive and learn from the Bible? Or is this a shrewdly devised political vision that allows the multiplicity of the world to be taken into the unity of the structures of the Catholic Church? I think that is the issue that we have to face. There is the individual and interrelational aspect. We all live surrounded by Catholic friends and even Catholic believers, and we should be as friendly as we can and supportive as we can to promote the gospel in any possible legitimate way. But we have to be aware that beyond the people, beyond the persons, beyond our friends, there is a religious, ecumenical, and political project that is still there and looks for ways to be implemented in the long term, in the short term. And Vatican II is the theological program that is backing this vision. So we need discernment, and we need, therefore, theological awareness. We need historical awareness. We need what I call a systemic approach, an approach that would take into account single doctrines, their developments, single practices, movements, ideas, things that happen, and with the ability to relate all these elements to the basic core and framework that animates it and drives it forward.
Jacob, would you want to add to that?
I think, again, the question is extremely complicated. As Wayne was saying, there's opportunity to unite on certain issues. In the last couple of weeks, we would have been very happy to unite with the Catholic Church in Ireland on the issue of same-sex marriage, as we've engaged in that debate. In other places, it becomes more difficult. I think it's not as simple as to say Catholic versus Protestant. See, I grew up in Catholic Ireland as a Catholic, so I have 700 years of history that doesn't endear me to Protestantism very well. So I actually very seldom, if ever, would use that term to describe myself, because it reacts against a whole history of our nation from where I come from. So there's a lot of things involved. From the perspective of the Irish Bible Institute, what we have done is we've taken a policy that says we will seek to have fellowship with anyone who is in Christ, who has relationship with him and understands justification in those terms. But we will not have fellowship on an organizational level with the Catholic Church.
That's a very important distinction. So we cooperate with Roman Catholics on pro-marriage, pro-life issues politically, but recently, within the last month, there was a push by Roman Catholics in the Phoenix area to have a joint prayer service to pray for these issues, and many Protestants, including myself, were very nervous about that, because then there's giving a public signal that we're very much the same in our worship, and we are not.
Can I ask on that? One of the motivations, Wayne, for evangelicals and Catholics together, which was a document that tried to look at what we hold in common theologically. One of the motivations behind that was the fighting happening in South America and in Ireland over Protestant Catholic differences. And the thought was, if we can find a degree of commonality theologically, then we'll actually find Protestant Catholic cultures able to get along with each other better. Are you saying we need to be able to work together socially, but that shouldn't be confused with a theological agreement?
Yes, because there is not going to be theological agreement, because the Roman Catholic Church has not changed, is not going to change. This is what Leonardo is doing in his writings. Council of Trent is still official. It's a both and. We're going to believe what we've always believed and be welcoming to other people. Well, then we're not going to get theological unity except by vague language that covers up the differences. And to give a public testimony of, and see, if a Baptist church and a Pentecostal church and a Lutheran church in our town and a Methodist church who are Bible believing get together for a joint worship service, we're just meaning, let's be friends with each other and let's have a joint worship service or a Christmas service or something. We're just saying we lay it on an equal basis. But if a Roman Catholic church and a Baptist church tried to have a same worship service, the Catholics are thinking, we're absorbing you into our organizational worldwide structure, and the unity that's going to happen is by you becoming part of the one true church. That's a very different viewpoint.
Jacob, can I ask you, since you mentioned your personal history there, so you grew up a Catholic and you're now an evangelical.
Yes.
Could you describe that shift? So you've been able to look over both sides of the fence, really.
Okay.
Could you describe what it was that enabled that shift? So we can feel an insider's view from within Roman Catholicism, and then what it was you saw that led you to an evangelical faith.
Well, when I came to faith, back in the late 70s, I ultimately went to Canada to go to Bible college, because it was easier to do that than to go to England or Northern Ireland. There was enough struggle within my family that I had left the church, etc., etc. So there was massive issues there. But on one occasion when I was in Canada, I remember being asked, so what's it like being a Protestant in Ireland? And with about 2 seconds of thought and 700 years of prejudice, I responded, without thinking, I'm not Protestant, I'm Irish. Because to be Irish was to be Catholic. And so your whole culture is wrapped up in your religion. And I would probably like to differ on your point of religious violence, for example, in Northern Ireland. It just happens that the religious divides are the same as the political divides.
That's helpful.
You know? And I suspect in many other places that's the same thing. And therefore, one of the, I suppose, passions behind the Irish Bible Institute was for new believers in Ireland to figure out, well, who are we if we are no longer Catholic? Are we not Irish anymore, and what does that look like? And there's a great tension in that. I was one of the first, I'll use other people's language, not my own. I was one of the first converted Catholics to lead an evangelical church in the south of Ireland. And I remember being at a conference in Northern Ireland. A number of us as from the church were there. And I was introduced as a converted Catholic. And I decided I wasn't going to get into the debate. I was just going to get on with what I had to do. But one of my fellow elders got up after me, and he introduced himself as a converted Protestant. And he got into trouble about it by a few people later. See, there was a sense that Catholics had to be converted. Protestants just had to grow into their faith. But if we agree with Bebbington and Stott and McAllister, we have to be crisis-centered, conversion-centered, regardless of our background or history. And therefore, I think that becomes the issue. And I think one of the massive issues we face in Ireland today is, like when I came to faith in late 70s, the single biggest issue I had to deal with was, what about Catholic Church? How do I now live? Today, it's a non-issue, because most of the people who are under 35 aren't going to church anyway. In a sense, the book talks about papal infallibility. And if we're talking church to church, we need to get our head around that stuff. But the average person in Ireland, you talk to them about papal infallibility and they'd say, really? They don't even believe God's infallible. Why would they worry about the Pope? Even as good Catholics. That's the difficulty.
Can I move the question on to the papacy more specifically? Leonardo, one question here. We've got a few questions about the papacy. One is a very applied one. How should we, as evangelical Christians, think of Pope Francis with his humanitarian efforts and his statements? Can we trust him? What should we make of him?
When he was elected, he was welcomed as if he were the new Lionel Messi of Latin America, or Maradona for my generation. I think that we are still in the process of getting to know Pope Francis, because unlike Benedict or Ratzinger, he wasn't a published theologian. He had hardly written a booklet in publication. So it was. I as part of my work, I also work as a journalist at the Vatican press room. And the following day after his election, the journalists were saying, "But who is he? What has he written? What does he think about a number of issues?" And nobody really knew. And gradually he's unfolding what he thinks. I think we have to bear in mind few general points. First, he is a Jesuit, and that has something to say to us. He belongs to an order that goes back to the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. And the only book he published in the 80s was a series of lectures that he gave on the history of the Jesuits, talking about Luther as a heretic, Calvin as a schismatic, and Luther and Calvin being the chief causes of all the evils of the West, the beginnings of what the West eventually had to face in terms of its secularism, communism, nihilism, relativism. Bergoglio attributed the whole lot of all the evils of the West to the schism and the heresy of the Protestant Reformation, particularly against Calvin. Calvin, for Bergoglio, was a very warring figure and a very negative picture of Calvin. Now, this is one thing. He's Latin American, so he brings with him this Latin American ethos, personality, and very different from the average curial type of outlook, and we have to become conversant in understanding where he comes from. And but then he has been an archbishop for many years, responsible for Buenos Aires, and also at times president of the Conference of Bishops in Latin America. So he is not an outsider totally. So we have to understand. And he has a language that looks like a language of an average Pentecostal Latin American pastor. But if you read his speeches and his writings, and beyond the commonality of words, always talks about mission, being a missionary church, mission-minded church, outward-looking church. It means he is totally within the world of Vatican II. Mission for him is not going out in order to save, to tell the message of Jesus in order that people will be saved out of their being lost. It's a message of affirming people where they are in order to call them closer to the center, closer to the Catholic Church if they want to come, but assuming that they are already somehow in a state of grace. Who am I to judge? Who am I to convert you? Muslims and Hindus are brothers and sisters because we are all humans and we worship the same God. This is the language of Pope Francis. So we have homework to do in order to understand what he is saying to us, not because we want to impose on him our external grids, but because we want to be fair to what he is saying and what he believes and what he is for. So there is homework to do, and his humanitarian flavor is part of his personality, but also part of his missional, worldview, whereby you need to go out in order to call people to come closer. And in this call, he uses a quasi-evangelical language without, as far as I'm concerned, intending it.
That's very helpful, thank you. I've got a question that's not so much about the present day, but the origins of the papacy. A few questions on this. Wayne, where does the papacy get its justification? Is it simply taken over from the Roman idea of the Pontifex Maximus, or is there biblical justification? Did, for example, St. Augustine believe in the papacy?
No. The expert is sitting next to you on the history of the papacy.
I've got other questions for him.
So, as far as biblical justification, I think Leonardo does an excellent job in this book, saying that the New Testament presents a very realistic view of Peter, not an idealistic view. He makes mistakes. He is a sinner. He's not viewed as superior to the other apostles. Jesus didn't build his church upon a fallible, sinful human being, but upon the confession of faith in himself as Lord. And Peter presents himself as a fellow elder, not as one superior to the other elders in 1 Peter 5. So Leonardo's description, Leonardo in this book on the papacy does an excellent job of gently but decisively destructing the Roman Catholic attempt to justify the papacy from the New Testament. It simply can't be done.
Leonardo, if you want a video endorsement for your book, I think you've just got it there.
Now, just to come back to the historical question, of course, it was a process that was also motivated by the inner tensions of the early church that led even fathers like Irenaeus to begin to compile or write lists of bishops of Rome in order to prove that those who were in fellowship with the existing Bishop of Rome were in fellowship with the Catholic Church. And Irenaeus is also a great father but also he made, a significant mistake in that first list of bishops of Rome, in that he claimed that the Church of Rome had been founded by Peter and Paul, which is not historically true, by the simple fact that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, using the word church, Romans chapter 16, and Greek, the church that meets there, before even visiting the city of Rome. So the great Irenaeus made this, fatal mistake that introduced the idea that Peter and Paul are the pillars of the Church of Rome, and the first two apostles that initiated the whole mechanism of the transmission of their authority onto the successors. And basically that process had a very decisive moment in the 4th century when, as the Roman Empire faded away and the imperial structure faded away, what was left in Rome was not a vacuum, but was an imperial church carry on with the same imperial structures, names, prerogatives, and agenda. The only difference being that at that point, that imperial structure also had added religious claims and religious prerogatives, but basically carry on the same structures in terms of power. And then eventually it was even more consolidated by the beginning of the political role of the Bishop of Rome as a head of state. In the 9th century, territories began to form the papal state, and they went through until 1870, when that papal state was reduced to what is now Vatican City, still a political state with a head of state, claiming therefore political prerogatives, but being reduced in terms of its extension. And in 1870, dogmatizing the office of the Pope by attributing to him infallibility on certain, with certain restrictions and constraints, but giving dogmatic status to this role that basically came out of the Roman imperial structure. Although then, during the course of history, the Catholic Church has tried to reproject that structure, trying to justify it in terms of being a development stemming out of the Bible. So reprojecting backwards an attempt to give warrant and justification to a structure that had basically been emerged not from the Bible or from a development, but from the replacement of the Roman imperial structures.
We're fast running out of time, so I've got just a couple more I'd like to throw out. The first I'd like to throw it again to our resident experts, since we're running out of time, and then I'd like to throw one to everyone. So, Leonardo, how do Roman Catholics and evangelicals differ on sin and grace? And is it important for everyday believers?
They use the same words, sin and grace, but I'm talking about the theological magisterial level. They mean very different things. According to Roman Catholic magisterial theology, sin is a very serious thing, but not as radical and as tragic as the Bible portrays it. There is always an openness, a capability that is left in the human heart, in the human being, to be engraced by the work of God. And there is always a basis out of which God can work out his salvation, a basis that allows the human being to cooperate and to be a partner with God in achieving one's own salvation. So even in daily life, if you have a different, substantially different view of sin, it then leads to having a different view of grace, and it then leads you to have a different view of salvation on the whole.
So you're more self-dependent because sin isn't so radical. You can depend on yourself to an extent, and grace is an enabling of you to do better, but that's not going to leave you with total trust in Jesus. You must be relying on yourself to some extent.
You know, Vatican II and post-Vatican II developments introduced the idea, or developed the idea, that our state of grace depends on our being human beings. As we are born, we are already in a state of grace, and the process of salvation is coming closer to the fountain, to the dispenser of the full measure of grace. That is the Catholic Church. That is the journey. And so as you journey on, you try to find, to make a step forward, but on the assumption that you being a human being, it means that you are already in a state of grace, and you can possibly only go forward, not going backwards, if you are a living being. So that changes, and the language is the same, but changes dramatically the whole picture and the whole significance of the Christian life.
Thank you. That's extremely significant for how we speak to Roman Catholic friends and how we think of our own Christian lives. One last question I'd like to put it to every one of you, starting with Jacob, if this is okay. But I'd like your answers to be quite brief since we're running out of time. So only a few short sentences. Where do you think the Roman Catholic Church will be going in this century? Might we be seeing a reformation in the Catholic Church? Is that possible?
I think certainly in Europe, the Catholic Church is facing significant change. It has to be. The average age of the religious in Ireland is 66 at the moment. So something has to change. The very figures will show that. So demographics will bring change. What that change will look like, I am unsure.
Wait.
Well, after reading Leonardo's book about the Pope as the vicar of Christ, the Church as the ongoing incarnation of Christ, and the ability to adapt and develop new developments while remaining the same, my guess is that the Roman Catholic Church will continue to become very friendly and warm and welcoming and unchanged in its doctrine and its view of the Pope and its view of the nature of the Church and its view of grace and its view of salvation. And I mean, even in what we were talking earlier about Jesus only, for me, that's coming directly to Jesus. For Catholics, that's coming through Mary, praying through Mary to Jesus. And the benefits of salvation in Christ come to me through the mediation of Mary to me. So Jesus only doesn't even mean the same thing to me as to them. And I don't think that's going away.
I think there will be a growing gap between different fractions within the Catholic Church. Because what we see already, Catholics reading the scripture, they are getting more and more independent in their thinking. And even if Vatican is still trying to hold them within, there are lots of groups that are leaving. Some are staying, but there are many such interior reformers. And as we all know, struggle always builds muscles. So they are really much more active than most of the Protestants. And we should avoid a picture of looking at Jesus being a Protestant and Mary being Catholic.
Leonardo.
Yeah, I think that there is changes are occurring and happening. I think the basic concern is to how to find ways. It is what John Paul II wrote in his 1995 encyclical Ut Unum Sint. Our challenge is to find a way to look for new ways of living out the papacy without altering the substance of it. So the genius of Catholicism is now trying to find ways of looking for ways of exercising papal authority, the papal office, in a way that It doesn't change the theological substance, but is friendlier, more dynamic, less hierarchical, at least in its outlook, and looking for more collegiality, looking for more political ways of using authority, but without altering and changing the core. And this is exactly what the Roman Catholic Church has always been doing, trying to find new ways of doing things without altering the core. And unless a dramatic, radical, biblical change occurs in the core of the system, it will always try to expand itself without purifying its very core.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to end there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your contributions now. Especially thank you, Leonardo, for taking the time to write a book that is an important message for us to hear today. Will be a blessing for the church today. Thank you for your efforts in that.